I know, I'm trying. What's an exciting program without a struggle at the front? Okay, so without further ado, many of you know this person's voice from 7 years of hosting Morning Edition on WGBH, or previously, much previously, being managing director at WOMR in Provincetown, or before that, WQRC. Anyway, here he is. Maybe you know him from Eastham Superette. Welcome, Bob Seay.
Thank you. And welcome to church. Here we are. I need one other assistance here because I don't see my slide program on the computer, so you're going to have to comply. So, see, this is what I'm seeing now. Anyway, I want to thank all of you for coming. The Hopper thing never fails to draw a big crowd, so you're among many people who have appreciated this artist, and the hunger for Hopper is insatiable, I can tell you. This has been a great journey for me because it actually began with his painting of this building in 1948, and I began to investigate it. And the more I found out about his travels to Eastham, the more interested I became. Now, he certainly did not paint that many paintings here, certainly not near the number he painted in Truro. But his reasons for coming here and what he did here are very illustrative of his technique, his thoughts, and how he approached painting. So I'm very happy to be able to bring this to you. I don't know why it took him 5 years to do the self-portrait, but anyway, this is Edward Hopper, and I always begin by talking about Hopper because after one talk, somebody came up to me and said, who is this guy, Edward Hopper? And I thought, wow, I would have thought you would have known coming to the lecture, but they didn't really know. So basically, Hopper, lived from 1882 to 1967. He is considered to be a realist, but he considered himself an impressionist painter because of his obsession with light. And he did some of his most beautiful work here on Cape Cod, and that's why we're very lucky to be able to talk to you about him. The journals that I'm going to read to you, entries are from the Bible, Gail Levin's book, Edward Hopper, An Intimate Biography. And Provincetown Art Association and Museum has a lot of these journals. And I've been up there to look at some of them, and it's fascinating because Jo was exuberant, she held nothing back, and had it not been for her writing, we would know nothing about Edward Hopper on Cape Cod. So we have her to thank. It's important to realize that this kind of unlikely looking couple met in Gloucester 100 years ago this summer. And there's a fabulous exhibit right now at the Cape Ann Museum. If you're really interested in Edward Hopper and Jo, you really should see it. Spectacular. And the thing that you learn is when they arrived in Gloucester and first met, she was the celebrated painter. He was nobody. He hadn't sold a painting since 1914. And she was exhibiting in London, Paris, New York, Brooklyn. And within 4 years, he completely eclipsed her as a painter. But she's the one who got him started and said, you really should do watercolors. And so he began, and the famous mansard roof was the painting that really sent him on his way. So the Gloucester exhibit is great because it talks about Jo Hopper and her influence. And even though there is plenty of fighting and tumultuous scenes between the Hoppers, they always stayed together, which shows something about their dedication to each other. This painting is in the Gloucester exhibition. It's the only oil he ever did of Jo, who served as his model, his inspiration, and named a lot of the paintings. And I throw this painting in because they did a lot of work in their car. The car was like a mobile studio. And so this is from the trip out west, but in fact the painting of the chapel is done from his car. So he also, once said he never set foot in Provincetown. And people were saying, well, there's 3 paintings, famous paintings. He said, yeah, but I never got out of my car. So, I don't know if you could believe that story. Those of you who believe he was in love with Cape Cod, to disabuse that notion, it's like he had a bad summer rental or something. It's like, and actually, they did have a bad summer rental. Can you all see that? You want me to read it? So they had a cottage called the Bird Cage, which gave you an idea of how, secure it was against the weather. There were mice and there were all kinds of animals, and it was raining, and so Hopper finally says, we gotta get a place so I can paint. So now we're going to turn to the paintings. This is 1925. The first painting recognized by Lloyd Goodrich, famous art critic. Remember that name because it will come up again. And he said, this is Hopper coming into maturity. 1925, just 2 years after he was in Gloucester. So you can see he's starting to kind of find himself. And the reason I use this painting is because of the first painting he did in Eastham. A couple of things about this painting. First of all, the strong vertical, right? The omnipresent utility pole. No wires, ever. He's not interested in wires. And I want you to look at the grasses on the bottom, the color. Most of the work he did was in October, September, October. And this is one of the things that really drew him to Eastham, was the grass color that he absolutely loved. So he goes to this house, and Jo observes that there's a well-behaved group of children and a family and living there. And of course, none of them are in this painting. In fact, there are no people in any of the paintings in Eastham. Right? So this building is this building today. Up near Railroad Avenue. And that's why you had that large tower-like structure, because that's where the postmaster, whoever, would go up to see the trains coming and going. So that's why that attracted Hopper, that feature. So this was the very rainy season. And Edward thought if he had a study, he could work indoors. So that led them to Cape Cod because Jo had a relationship with people in the Provincetown Players. She was drawn to Provincetown. And Hopper liked it in Truro because it was so bleak and isolated, I guess. It was really back in 1930, you can imagine what it was like. 500 people living in town. It was far away. In fact, Jo used to hate it because she hated to cook anyway. But if she ever had to go buy anything, it was a day-long trip, But even though they had been to Quebec, Gloucester, he liked South Truro best. It's settled. They bought land for the house in 1933. So this is the house. This has also lots of information. This is 1960 when Arnold Newman took this photograph. And he said, you know, Joe, she's a wonderful person, but she won't get out of the damn picture. She just keeps showing up. You know, he was trying to get a picture, and then he realized that that was the relationship in that photograph. He was in the foreground, and she was in the background. And frankly, he never really helped her or encouraged her. It's really kind of harsh the way he treated her a lot of times, and it's very sad. Okay, so he's in Truro. Well, he started to get a little bored with Truro. I know Truro people don't like to hear that. But. So he started driving through Wellfleet to Eastham, and this is what caught my eye. The town he came to prefer on that end of the Cape. That end of the Cape meaning anywhere but Provincetown. And here's what Joe thought of Eastham. Eastham. And he has all these marvelous Truro hills stretch out all around us. No, they're too unusual, too off by themselves, of their own kind, unique. You must go to Eastham to get the same old story. And can you beat that? And he hates New Jersey and Westchester. Of course, when he comes to Eastham, he doesn't paint Nauset Light or Fort Hill or Coast Guard Beach or Nauset Marsh. He paints like an intersection or a house. I mean, and that's Hopper. He is a contrarian. He's not painting beautiful pictures. He's trying not to paint beautiful pictures. What he is painting is a good question, and only he knows when he's gotten to that point. And when he's most successful is when we all get it, you know, too. So, his second painting, a watercolor called House with a Big Pine. He began a canvas of a clam digger, but it wasn't going well. And you can see why. This really, it's kind of like a boring painting. And in fact, he sort of put it at the back of his pile of paintings in Truro, never really recognized it, wrote about it, or recorded it, which was a shock to one of my guests at one of my lectures who had helped Paul Allen, the Microsoft co-founder, curate an exhibit about the American landscape. And Paul Allen had bought this painting. So that after the talk, the guy came to me, you know, I had no idea that it was a reject. I said, well, I won't ask what Paul paid for it, but, you know, really, frankly, it was not something Hopper really liked. And Joe noted that it was not going well, this painting, so it never really surfaced. But this painting did. So this is House with Big Pine. And what's interesting is the fences. He has a very, you know, conscious use of that fence. The light on the side of the house, of course. And a pole going who knows where. Poles, you know, so that's House with Big Pine. And that house, is up on Massasoit Road. A bit difficult to see because it's obscured by the trees, but if you take a close look at it, you'll see it is basically that house. And that's up near where Herringbrook and Massasoit meet, which was kind of a favorite spot for Hopper. I call it Hopper's Corner. But this is the kind of thing he would paint. An intersection. Oaks at Eastham. It's all about the color. That's why he would come here in the fall, and that's why he would paint here. Here's another one, 1938. A railroad crossing, which is Railroad Avenue and Nauset Road. Right? So June came and went. Edward ranged even farther in search. Only at mid-July, all the way down in Eastham, but he had spotted something to sketch. And by mid-August, Joe was reporting progress on a new oil. Okay, now this gets a little complicated, and the owner of this house is with us today, Nancy Rabke. And this house is interesting because it was the subject of not only one drawing and a painting, but two paintings with two completely different titles. These are some notes he made, and I must say that a lot of these notes are all about color. They're not about architectural detail. They're all notations of color. So here's the drawing for a house via road in 1940. And he loved the complexity of the house, the dark windows, the empty space. And that becomes House by a Road. And it becomes House on the Cape. He really is into this house. I mean, this is very unusual that he would spend all this time. And what is he, what is he figuring out? Well, Joe has some interesting comments about how Edward sometimes doesn't even realize what he's painting. He doesn't see things that she sees, Now, I'm not sure what year this is from, Nancy, but maybe somebody can date the car.
About 1940.
About 1940.
And neighbors, long before I heard about painting, actually, just found this photo at his home.
Yeah.
And he said, I thought you might like it, but it's about the same print. And I sent a copy of this photo to Whitney. I met some people when they were doing a program on sketches on the Cape. And so I said, I live in a house that's appears to be it. So that kind of confirmed it for them. Yeah. It was every detail on the house in that photo.
Right.
Exactly like it.
And Nancy, it's just an example. When I started doing this 7 years ago, people in the audience would say, I own that house, or I know where that is. But I do have to credit Noel Bile. I don't know how many people remember Noel. He was the one who worked with me to do a lot of this locating of these sites. I have to give him credit. Just before he died, he gave me all the information that he had. Okay, so they're on Cape Cod, but let's go somewhere else. 1941. Joe keeps nagging him to stop and paint, but he just got gripped by a desire to get back to her that made no sense at all. Back to the Cape, where he's eaten up about everything and has the worst time trying to hatch material for a picture. Now, I love this sketch. This is Nauset Road. I don't know how many of you know where this intersection is. This is like the old Nauset Farm building. You used to have a sign on it, or an indication. So that's where that location is. It is not near Eastham, but in fact in Eastham. So August of 1941, Hopper had, painter's block. He suffered from losing all inspiration and motivation. And as she says, increasingly difficult to dig up subjects, but in October, goes down to Eastham to have another look at a house and barn formations he'd had his eyes on for years. Joe says, it doesn't look like much, but I've been mistaken so often. So this is the beginning of perhaps the most famous Eastham painting by Edward Hopper, Route 6, Eastham. There he is beginning, see how much space the road takes up. You can see how it's going to evolve. But what's very interesting about this painting, and this is a very famous drawing of notes. If you went to the opening of the new Whitney Museum, a whole wall was this. Okay? So what are these notes? They're all colors. So he doesn't set up an easel on Route 6 and paint that house. He draws sketches of the house and he makes notations about color. How he does this is what's phenomenal about his method, which is so unusual. And I don't think, it's not consistent, but he did it with this painting. So this is the result. Absolutely beautiful. You know, the combination of the utility poles and the road, it takes it beyond kind of forever. And the sky. Hopper was really into skies. In fact, he would come back to the scene to like try to get the sky right. And if you live out here, you recognize that sky. Absolutely beautiful sky. So what is that building? It is the painted dog down on Route 6, B&B. The woman who owns this claims I've never mentioned this painting in my lecture, so I want to make sure I do all the time because of the technique he used. And this is a little farther view of the painted dog, right? So it's there. So here's another Arnold Newman photograph of Hopper. He's trying to get Hopper in a casual mood or something, but he obviously looks pretty uptight. And I love this picture because Newman also photographs Jackson Pollock, who has a dangling cigarette, but is doing something completely different. And this dichotomy between these two styles of painting, you know, Hopper considered abstract expressionism a fad that would disappear. And he really loathed it, which is one of the reasons he had problems in Provincetown. So he's standing there, in front of him is a blank canvas. And then Pearl Harbor happens. And this is his reaction to Pearl Harbor. Now, I could spend the whole lecture on this painting. But he worked so hard on this painting, rearranging the people, rearranging the objects, trying to figure out, and he was really into it, right? And this is what it finally became, which is this, you know, iconic American painting. So it's World War II. He can't afford to use tires to go hunting down in his own particular happy hunting ground at Eastham. The one place, she doesn't give up, the one place on the Cape shorn of most all Cape glamour. It might be anywhere except for the light and tall grass. It's incredible what he has unearthed there. Now he's reduced to hunting down the lowest common denominator of Cape here at Truro, where its special beauty is shown about in greatest richness. No, he doesn't want that. Too exotic, too special. Not quite camel's hump, is it? It's like, okay, so then Edward takes a trip down toward Eastham, and he makes this sketch. I don't really know where this is. He's having trouble figuring out what to do with it, but this is what transpires. Wow. And Joe comments, it's amazing how much color he can drain from a painting. And Hopper's ability to remove things is really one of his keys to aesthetic success. Solitude, the only Hopper title that refers to the mood. 56, the number of the road. Now, I've searched a lot of books and asked people, where was number 56? Nobody seems to know. But what an exquisite painting. And once again, the colors of the grass, the emptiness of the house. Beautiful. Okay, now we move up to 1948, a very difficult year for Hopper. Many of his friends had died. He underwent 3 separate prostate surgeries, which you can imagine in 1948. And it wasn't until late July that he and Joe made it to the Cape. At this point, he was very famous, and his paintings were very much in demand. But I wish I could paint more, he says. I don't have the impulse. I do dozens of sketches for oils, and then I almost always burn them. Following his surgery, Hopper went for months without picking up a brush, and the slump lasted through the summer on the Cape. Then over a 2-week period in September, he worked on and finished one of his most remarkable oil paintings. And what's interesting about this, he wanted sturdy oak trees, and he couldn't get them. These gnarly locusts kept coming out, and he had no control over it. Joe says, what's this? What's in the store? What does the store sell? I don't know. I don't want people to know. What is it? Now, he claims that this was modeled after a bookstore in Nyack, where he grew up. But you know, if you're standing there at Hopper's Corner and you turn around, what do you see? Now, I don't want to dispute Hopper, but wow. Our little thrift store, the oven mitten factory. Okay, 1948 again, hoping against hope. They go out to scout for subjects, nothing crystallizes, all impact of surprise is eliminated, years of familiarity. Ranging about these parts for 18 years, he's produced many pictures. Now he can no longer dig up any material for new work. This is important to understand. He, as a dead end, clearly feeling pressure to produce something for the Whitney, he drives to Wellfleet on October 16th to see if he can force himself to do a watercolor. And he returns at dusk with the start of a watercolor painted in Eastham. Now, this doesn't look like the work of a depressed man, right? This is very beautiful. It's very life-affirming. I saw the original in 1989. It was the centerpiece of the Whitney Hopper exhibit at that time. Beautiful painting. We'll talk a little bit about what's in this painting, but once again, there's the ubiquitous utility pole. But here, it really does look like a cross. And it's in this religious context, which is unusual for him. And where you would expect to see the cross, the top of the steeple is cut off. He's painting this from his car. He's parked right out here. So what happens is on the very last day, he's here. In some kind of desperation, he's driving up Somerset Road and he sees this. And it's really very beautiful. I mean, look at the chapel, you know it's the chapel. And he's not using rulers, I mean, he's painting. And like he always likes to do, the left side or one side of the painting is man-made or human-made structures, and the other side is how nature builds. And he loves to combine those two. and you can see the October colors. So Joe says, Eastham, of all the unlikely places. And it's always Eastham to which E repairs, and such good things he has unearthed. And it looks more like Jersey than Cape Cod. It really is a beautiful painting. And it's only one of two that he painted in 1948 at the height of his success. Okay, so I was interested, what was his state of mind? So I went up to Provincetown and spent some time looking at Joe's letters. And I won't read the whole letter, but what happens is Lloyd Goodrich, the man who first gave Hopper cred with that house by the railroad painting in 1925, wants Hopper to be the subject of a one-man exhibit at the Whitney. So Hopper's back in New York. He doesn't even come to the phone. And Goodrich is, shocked. And so Joe writes an apology letter to Lloyd, saying you have to understand how sick he is. He's really not well. We had a really hard time leaving Truro because the guy who usually closes up the house had died, and they had to do it all themselves, and Hopper was not doing well. So she writes this whole involved letter, and then at the very end, she chides Hopper, saying, you're a man of much reserve. You should not be expected to be impatient, for lack of it, but she apologizes for Edward's behavior. And then she says, it's about time that Edward took responsibility for this. I'm the one who has to clean this up all the time. So she chides it. Of course, Hopper's out flat on the bed. He's very ill, which makes that watercolor even more extraordinary in my mind. Okay, so we're going to move ahead to one of his final Eastham paintings, Mass of Trees. This was across the street from the Church of the Visitation, the Catholic church on Massasoit Road in North Eastham. And what's interesting about this painting is that it also becomes this painting. And you can see, generally Hopper's watercolors are representational or realistic. His oils are surrealistic, like Route 6 Eastham. The most surrealistic thing about it is there's no traffic. So this, thanks to my friend Deb Ullman, she said, he did another painting of road and trees. And I said, wow, that's really great to see that, combination. And you'll see, like, when he originally did it, he had a car, which kind of spoils the whole thing. So once again, Hopper's in the process of removing things to get to the essence of what we're looking at. So when we put it all together, this is basically where he did his work in Eastham. Most of it in North Eastham, and a couple in the southern part of the town. And I don't want to leave out Orleans. This is a classic Orleans painting because he had friends in Orleans, as you saw in this previous letter. It's really a beautiful one. And this also originates in Orleans. The house on the left doesn't exist. Just the house on the right actually existed. And it was somewhere, we think, along Route 6A in Orleans, and he added the other house. And this has that, creepy kind of thing where the windows look like eyes. He's really into that. Jo is very proud of her title. She was the one who titled this painting, Two Puritans. My friend Noel thought that the original house was this one, which is the Rogers and Gray Insurance Building in Orleans, but we have no way of really documenting that. So this is the last painting he does on Cape Cod, 1965, which ironically is the kind of postcard view that, you know, he eschewed for the most part. So works by Hopper rarely appear on the market. He was not prolific, painting just 366 canvases during the 50s. He produced about 5 paintings a year. This, by the way, is the highest priced Hopper ever sold, $92 million. But you can see his mastery of color. It's really phenomenal. Okay, now we're going to get into a new part of my talk, which has to do with something called de-accessioning. At the height of the coronavirus pandemic, the Association of Art Museum Directors loosened its regulations on U.S. museums de-accessioning work to allow for proceeds to be used for the direct care of permanent collections. Previously, the guidelines said that income had to be spent on additional art purchases. Director Adam Weinberg said he was open to the idea of de-accessioning. I love that term. The museum was undergoing a 3-year review. Well, one of the dubious distinctions of our little chapel painting was the first one that Whitney tried to get rid of. I just learned this from an art critic I know in London who writes for the art newspaper. So there was one auction that failed, a second auction that failed. See, I think Laura was joking with me, if we had waited, maybe we could have bought it. And then it was a private sale was arranged. We don't know who bought it. I have to work through Sotheby's to find out, which is not easy. But this is kind of, you know, this began the controversy. What are you doing selling off this collection that was bequeathed to you by Joe Hopper? The latest painting was a classic painting, Cobb's Bar in South Truro, which went for $6 million in May. So this is the beginning of a controversial process that you'll probably be hearing more about, that, you know, the Whitney says, well, we're using the money to buy new works, right? You might also know that Whitney just raised its ticket prices. This is a big new museum they may be having trouble paying for. I have no idea. But they literally have millions and millions, if not billions of dollars worth of art in their holdings. So what's the process of preventing the whole thing from leaving? That's something you're going to continue to hear about. So, of course, Hopper never liked to talk about his work. He famously said, you know, if you could explain it in writing, there'd be no reason to paint. But he was forced by the Museum of Modern Art to actually make a statement in 1953. And from it, great art is the outward expression of an inner life in the artist. This inner life will result in his personal vision of the world. If you could say it in words, there'd be no reason to paint. And no amount of skillful invention can replace the essential element of imagination. And this is what makes Hopper so attractive and identifiable as an artist. His personal vision is really secure. No matter what the rest of the art world is doing, he is doing his thing, and he's not wavering from it. And that's what makes him such a strong artist. And, you know, I believe he was the greatest American artist of the 20th century, if not one of the greatest American artists, because he was really defining American art. He was trying to separate it from France and Europe. What is American art? Trying to search for that. And I'll just, this particular final painting, I kind of really like, because it's sort of surrealism, abstract expressionism, and impression, and all wrapped into one. And Hopper had this fascination with things that just dropped off into the ocean. From a couple of his Wellesley paintings are like that. And he, there's a couple of paintings he did near the end of his life that were, I think there's one that shows just sunlight coming into a room. similar to this. So that's basically it. I think we've succeeded in getting through. And if you appreciated this talk this morning, please consider donating to our chapel preservation fund. That's how we continue to keep this building going. And there's some Hopper books if you'd like to read them, look at them. And in 2 weeks, we are going to have a play about Josephine and Edward Hopper. Is the actor who's playing Edward Hopper here? Look at that. It's a play by Deborah Weiss, Remembering Good Harbor Beach. This is where the Hoppers met. And then the second act takes place in Churro. You do a lot of grunting and mumbling. and what's John Dennis Anderson, right? There he is. And we'll have more of a discussion about the Hoppers. But this is a great opportunity. And once again, I really encourage you to, if you can, take a trip to Gloucester and the Cape Ann. It's a beautiful museum. Cape Ann Museum is lovely. So any questions? Yes.
This may be like jumping ahead to the play here, but we did have to get to the Cape Ann Museum recently. And one thing I took away from that was that Jo Hopper, rather than being eclipsed by Edward, I may have misunderstood it. She voluntarily, like other female artists, and withdrew in order to promote.
Yes, and you knew that.
And that was her decision.
Yep.
Repeat the question, please.
It was like women artists whose husbands became famous tended to.
Promoting.
Yeah, she promoted him, even though she resented it. She did promote him and provide him with a lot of was pushing and inspiration to do the work. And that's why I don't think they ever separated, because he really needed her there, and she just realized what a great artist he was. So it was a fraught relationship, but I mean, Hopper could have, if he was really upset, he could have walked away, but he never did.
Just to follow up, my thought was that maybe it's not that she lacked confidence in her own work, but I don't know for sure, but it seemed like what I got from the museum was that she was a great artist herself, but her role that she took on was promoting.
Yeah, and then unfortunately he left her in the dust once he got going and was recognized. Yes?
How do you obtain tickets for the play?
There are no tickets. It's going to be right here in 2 weeks at 10 o'clock. It's a very simple play, so it's not big sets or lots of it. And 2 short acts, 15 minutes, so each act, so that it'll leave enough time for discussion. Oh yes, and coming up, Lower Cape TV has done a lot of video programs about Hopper, and there's one coming up on the 30th of August at the Visitor Center in the Light of Hopper, I believe it's called. It's like a 45-minute film we'll be showing, which really gets into the churro. Whenever you see something about Hopper on Cape Cod, it's all about churro, which is really, and it should, a lot of it should be. But when I read things like what Joe is saying, this is his favorite place. He's always going down there. His happy hunting ground. That's really what got my interest. It was like, okay, so there's churro, but then what is that? What does that mean when he's not in churro, he's in Eastham? He's looking for non-special things, non-picturesque things. He's looking for things that aren't obviously beautiful, right? And that's really a part of what Hopper does. He gives us the commonplace, even in his urban paintings. It makes them really special. So that's his talent. Anyone else? Thank you all for coming. Oh, yes.
Does that explain his relationship to God and stuff? When I was very interested in thinking Provincetown was not what's happening.
No, it was not. It was enemy territory. Well, Provincetown. It's really interesting that he was right next to Provincetown. Of course, Joe had a lot of friends in Provincetown, and she always wanted to socialize there, and he didn't really want to go to that town hall. He was, he did 3 wonderful paintings, but didn't set foot. Right?
We invite you to stay for some hospitality and good conversation. If there's anyone in the hall who's under 50, we do that. You can look at the chairs.
Thank you.
Can you scroll back to the chapel picture?
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? So I can get up and I feel like, so your worst nightmare came true.
Huh?
Since your worst nightmare is